People like to believe desperation announces itself loudly, but it does not. It comes quiet, slipping into the bones before the mind has time to argue. It comes when pride runs out of places to hide. It comes the moment a person realizes there is nothing left to lose. Sarah May Hawkins had never begged in her life. Not once, not for kindness, not for mercy, not even when the world pressed hard against her chest. But that evening, hunger had hollowed her out, and fear had set her hands, shaking so badly she could barely feel them as she dropped to her knees in the dirt in front of the hardest man anyone in the territory spoke about without lowering their voice. The ranch hands called him Jed Stone, and they said his name the way men say storms are coming, like it was a warning that could not be stopped once spoken. He stood there tall and unmoving, axe still gripped in his hand, his body carved broad and solid as if the mountains themselves had shaped him, his face so stern it looked chiseled from old rock rather than flesh. Sarah lifted her chin even as tears burned behind her eyes and spoke the only thing that felt honest anymore, telling him she was not worth much but she could cook. Just one sentence cracked open by desperation, and in that single moment the path of her life bent without her knowing it. Only days earlier she had still been living in a small cabin that smelled like safety, a place where the walls knew her voice and the floor creaked in familiar ways beneath her feet. She was 31, young enough to believe pain eventually loosened its grip, young enough to think love was something that stayed. Then her husband died without warning. No long sickness, no chance for goodbye, just gone, taking her heart with him and leaving her to dig his grave with hands that shook so badly she had to stop and rest against the shovel to keep from collapsing. She thought grief would be the worst of it, believed sorrow would be the deepest cut she would have to survive, but she was wrong. A few mornings after the burial, men in dark coats knocked on her door, papers clutched tight in their hands, their faces stripped of sympathy before she ever spoke. They did not offer comfort, did not bow their heads or soften their voices. They offered cold words shaped by law and numbers that sounded unreal. Her husband, the man she trusted with her life, had left debts behind so heavy they felt impossible, borrowed money for ventures that failed, signed promises he never lived long enough to keep, and now the creditor stood in her doorway and told her the cabin and everything in it no longer belonged to her. Sarah tried to explain, told them she had signed nothing, knew nothing, had never agreed to any of it, but the man with dark glasses did not care. Marriage made her responsible, he said flatly, and he gave her 1 week to leave. Then, without ceremony or mercy, they began marking her life like it was nothing more than inventory. Furniture, blankets, tools, even the small keepsakes that held the weight of memory, all of it stripped away piece by piece while she stood there helpless, watching her past turn into a list. When the week ended, she walked away carrying nothing but a small bundle tied in cloth, and in the middle of that chaos she saved the only 3 things the creditors had no interest in: an old skillet blackened by years of use, a cracked clay pot that once belonged to her grandmother, and a wooden spoon worn smooth by hands long gone. They were worthless in money but priceless in meaning, the last living proof that her life had once been full. She took the trail with grief settled heavy in her chest, days hot and dry, dust clinging to her skin until she felt coated in it, her boots rubbing her feet raw, but she did not stop because stopping felt too close to giving up. The first night she slept beneath an oak tree while the stars stared down like distant strangers, listening to the dark breathe and forcing herself not to imagine what hunted lonely women on empty trails. The second day she drank from a creek and ate wild berries she recognized, her body weakening but something inside her refusing to lie down and disappear. By the third day the sun was sinking low, painting the sky in fire, when she saw a small frontier settlement ahead and felt a fragile hope lift inside her, just because people meant work and work meant food and food meant survival. The settlement itself was tired and dusty, chickens wandering between buildings, a thin dog sleeping under a porch like it had stopped expecting kindness long ago. Sarah wiped her face, straightened her torn dress, and began knocking on doors, speaking polite words through a throat tight with shame, offering work instead of begging, telling them her name and that she could cook biscuits and stews and roasts, asking only for food and a roof in return. One by one the doors closed, some before she finished speaking. A woman looked her over with open disgust and told her to leave. A man said he did not hire strangers. An old woman crossed herself like Sarah carried bad fortune. The words cut deeper than hunger because Sarah was not asking for charity. She was offering honest labor. But fear spoke louder than compassion in that place. When the last door shut and daylight faded, she sat in the plaza beside a dry fountain that looked like a promise long forgotten, her stomach growling so hard it made her dizzy. She spent her last coins at the general store on a small handful of beans, all she could afford, and stepped back into the empty square knowing night was coming fast and she could not survive another hungry sleep. So she did something that made people stop and stare, building a small fire in the open, filling her cracked clay pot with well water and pouring in the beans, then opening the little cloth bag she guarded like treasure, herbs and spices saved from better days, thyme and bay leaf and salt and pepper and dried garlic. Simple things but precious. Her hands moved with the calm memory of feeding people she loved, and as the beans simmered, the smell rose into the air, not the smell of poverty but the smell of home, drifting through the square and turning heads. She stirred with her worn wooden spoon and felt dignity return for the first time in days, because even stripped of everything she still knew how to care. An old man with white hair and a bent back approached, leaning on his stick, breathing in the scent like it unlocked something in him. He said it smelled mighty fine, and kindness in his eyes startled her more than cruelty ever had. She shared the beans though hunger clawed at her, and when he tasted them, tears slipped down his face as he told her it had been 12 years since his wife died and no one had cooked for him with love since. For the first time since losing everything, Sarah told the truth about death and debt and doors closing, and the old man listened without judgment before telling her of a ranch beyond the ridges owned by Jed Stone, a hard man in need of a cook, warning her he had been broken by loss. Hope clung to her ribs as she packed her pot and skillet and spoon and walked again, through night and mountain shadow, feet burning, fear close behind, until dawn painted the sky and Jed Stone's ranch appeared below, wide and solid and intimidating. She walked to the gate and asked for work, faced laughter and doubt, then heard the deep voice of Jed himself. And when he offered her 1 week to prove herself, she accepted without hesitation, not knowing that her real trial had only just begun. That night, Sarah lay awake on the narrow bed in the bunkhouse room. Buck had shown her staring at the low ceiling, as the weight of Jed Stone's words pressed down on her chest. 1 week, 7 days to prove she deserved a place to stand in the world. Outside, the ranch settled into its nighttime rhythm. Distant horse snorts, muted voices, the wind sliding down from the mountains and brushing the walls like a cautious hand. Fear sat with her, but it was not alone. Purpose had found its way back into her bones. A quiet resolve that told her she could not afford to fail. Not now, not after coming this far. Before the sun even thought about rising, she was on her feet. Cold water shocked her awake as she washed her face, tied her hair back tight, and stepped into the kitchen while the sky was still dark. The stove was cold, but she coaxed it to life with practiced hands, feeding it wood, listening to the crackle and sigh as warmth returned. She took stock of the shelves and sacks, measuring in her mind, planning meals that would stretch and satisfy. Meals meant for men who worked until their muscles screamed. Dough came together under her palms, flour dusting her fingers as muscle memory took over. Onions hit the board with a steady rhythm, garlic releasing its sharp promise, dried meat browning slow until it filled the room with a scent that felt like strength. Eggs were beaten smooth, a careful pinch of nutmeg warming them without stealing their soul. Coffee brewed dark and honest, the kind that carried a man through frost and heat alike. When the biscuits emerged golden and tall, Sarah allowed herself a single breath of relief before setting to plating. The ranch hands shuffled in, still half asleep, expecting the same dull fare they always did, and then they stopped. The smell hit them first, and it made them hesitate like something precious might vanish if they moved too fast. Plates were filled, cups poured, and when the first bite was taken, the room changed. Buck froze mid-chew, eyes widening, a soft sound escaping him before he could stop it. Others followed, silence falling not with dissatisfaction but with reverence. Men slowed, chewed, scraped plates clean. Compliments came awkward and sincere. Surprise threaded through every word. Sarah kept her head high, her hands steady, but inside something fragile lifted, something that had been crushed flat on the trail. Then came the tray for Jed Stone. Sarah chose carefully, the best of what she had made. Not out of fear, but out of respect for the chance she had been given. Buck carried it away, and when it returned empty later, Sarah said nothing. But her heart beat differently than it had the day before. The days that followed blurred into motion and heat and purpose. Sarah rose before dawn and worked until night claimed her. Stews thick enough to stick to ribs, bread that cracked warm and fragrant, beans slow-cooked until they carried depth instead of desperation. The men changed without realizing it, arriving early, lingering, laughing again in low tones like the ranch remembered how to breathe. Jed Stone remained distant, eating alone, speaking little, but his tray always returned clean. Sarah felt his eyes sometimes when she crossed the yard or hung cloths to dry, not weighing her like before, but studying her like a puzzle he did not yet understand. She refused to let herself read into it. Survival left no room for dreaming. On the 5th day, the air shifted. Voices carried wrong from the dining room. Laughter edged with something sour. Sarah heard her name twisted into jokes, heard her body spoken of like it was another tool on the ranch. Her hands tightened on the knife, jaw-locking as she forced herself to keep working, because reacting felt dangerous. When she entered the room, the laughter dropped, but the look stayed, smug and bold. Shame burned hot, but she served the plates with quiet dignity, telling herself she could endure anything for 2 more days. The next morning, one of the young hands leaned back and spoke to her, with a sweetness that crawled under her skin, the room erupting in laughter that made her hands shake hard enough to slosh coffee over the rim. Then the sound of boots stopped everything. Jed Stone stood in the doorway, eyes like winter, voice low and sharp as he cut the room apart. He named respect, demanded. It laid consequences heavy enough to make men swallow their pride. When his eyes met Sarah's, something passed there, brief but solid. Protection without spectacle. After that, the ranch quieted in a new way. The jokes died. The look softened or disappeared. That evening, Sarah added a small sweet to Jed's tray without thinking, an offering gentle and human, and when Buck returned wide-eyed saying Jed had eaten all of it, warmth settled in her chest like a held breath finally released. Changes came without explanation. Her room fixed itself. The kitchen gained small kindnesses. Jed began appearing more, finding reasons to linger, offering words that sounded like praise when he thought no one was listening. Then the sky turned. Wind snapped sharp, clouds bruised dark, and lightning split the afternoon open. Fire bloomed near the hay barn, fast and hungry, panic ripping through the yard as men shouted and ran. Jed froze, terror ancient and naked in his eyes, memory trapping him where he stood. Orders died in throats. In that moment, Sarah stepped forward and found a voice she did not know she owned, cutting through chaos, assigning tasks, forcing motion where fear tried to root them in place. Buckets flew, water hissed. Smoke burned, but the line held because Sarah held it together. She worked until pain blurred into heat and heat into will, until the flames weakened and finally surrendered. When it was done and the ranch still stood, Sarah saw Jed folded against a fence, grief breaking through the stone. She knelt beside him, steady and present, listening as he spoke of fire and loss and a wife he could not save. She did not argue with his pain. She anchored him to the present, to survival, to the fact that this ending was different. Rain fell soft, smoke lifted, and something shifted between them. Recognition forged in shared loss. After that day, Jed changed. Not loud, not fast, but real. He spoke to Sarah like a person, shared pieces of himself like they might shatter if dropped. One night under the stars, he told her she was wrong about her worth, that she had given the ranch back its heart. And when he asked her to stay, truly stay, Sarah felt a life she thought was gone settle back into her hands. Sarah did not answer Jed Stone right away when he asked her to stay. Not because she did not want to, but because some offers are so large they take a moment to fit inside the chest. The porch boards were cool beneath her hands, the night air steady and clean, and the stars overhead felt close enough to touch. She had learned that life could change in a blink, that safety could vanish without warning, and that promises, no matter how gentle, deserved respect before acceptance. Jed did not rush her. He sat beside her, shoulders heavy but relaxed in a way she had never seen before, as if simply saying the words had eased a burden he carried alone for too long. Eventually she nodded, slow and honest, and said she would stay not forever, not yet, but long enough to see where the path led. That was enough for him. The days that followed settled into a rhythm deeper than routine. Sarah was no longer just surviving from meal to meal. She was building something brick by brick, loaf by loaf. She learned the ranch's seasons, which men favored heavier breakfasts, who liked extra salt, who pretended not to care but always came back for seconds. She learned where the best herbs grew along the fence line and how the mountain weather could turn without warning. Jed watched her less like a mystery and more like a presence he had not realized he missed. asking her thoughts on supplies, listening when she spoke, trusting her judgment in small matters that grew larger with time. One afternoon he asked if she thought the men needed more rest breaks during the hottest part of the day. Sarah answered carefully but honestly, and when Jed adjusted the schedule the next morning without comment, she understood something important. He valued her not because she fed his ranch, but because she saw it clearly. The men noticed too. Respect deepened, not forced but earned. And when disagreements rose, they were settled faster, calmer, as if the ranch itself had learned a new language. Sarah's hands healed slowly from the burns, scars faint but present, reminders she did not hide. Jed noticed them once as she passed him a plate, his fingers hovering near hers before pulling back like he feared overstepping. "You should have rested," he said quietly. "Someone had to stand," she replied just as quietly, and the understanding that passed between them needed no more words. Weeks turned into months. The mountain shifted color, green giving way to gold, nights growing cooler. Jed began joining the men for meals now and then, sitting at the long table, listening more than speaking, his presence steady rather than looming. Sarah watched him soften in ways so subtle most would miss them, a corner of the mouth lifting, a laugh caught and released, a story about his wife shared without breaking apart. Mary Ellen's name no longer froze the air. It rested there, remembered, honored. One evening, as Sarah scrubbed pots by lamplight, Jed lingered in the doorway, watching her move with the same calm confidence that had saved his ranch. "I don't know how to say this without sounding like a fool," he said. Sarah turned, drying her hands, giving him her full attention. "Then don't dress it up," she said gently. He exhaled, a rough sound smoothed by honesty. "I was surviving before you came. Just surviving. I didn't notice it until things changed." Sarah felt something warm and careful open in her chest. "Surviving is hard work," she said. "So is living." He nodded like that truth settled deep. Not everything was easy. There were quiet nights when grief found them both, when Sarah dreamed of her husband's voice and woke. With tears she wiped away before dawn, when Jed stared too long into the fire and went silent for days. They did not fix each other. They did not try. They stood close enough that the weight was shared. That was enough. Trouble came again, as it always does, this time wearing a different face. A traveling creditor arrived at the ranch one afternoon, papers in hand, eyes sharp, voice slick with confidence. He spoke Jed's name but looked at Sarah. She recognized the type instantly, the practiced indifference, the belief that law excused cruelty. He claimed outstanding debts tied to her late husband, debts that followed her no matter where she went. Sarah felt the ground tilt beneath her feet, old fear roaring back, but she did not run. She stood still while Jed listened, jaw tightening, eyes hardening in a way she had not seen since the fire. When the man finished, Jed spoke low and final. "Any claim you have doesn't reach this land," he said, "and any claim you think you have on her ends here." The creditor scoffed, threatened law and seizure. But Jed stepped closer, presence heavy as stone. "You leave," he said. "Now." The man left. Sarah's legs shook once he was gone, the past clawing at her spine. But Jed placed a steady hand at her back, grounding her. "You're safe here," he said, not as a promise but as a fact. That night Sarah cried for the first time since arriving at the ranch, not from hunger or fear, but from the release of knowing someone would stand between her and the storm. The realization frightened her almost as much as it comforted her, because needing someone meant risking loss again. She told Jed as much days later, voice quiet, honest. He listened, nodding. "I won't promise you forever," he said, "but I'll promise you truth." That was enough. As winter edged closer, Sarah suggested preserving food, canning, planning for storms. Jed gave her full authority, and the ranch prepared better than it ever had. When the first snow came early and fierce, the men were fed, the animals sheltered, the fires burning steady. One night, snow piling high against the windows, Jed and Sarah found themselves alone in the kitchen after supper. Lamplight soft, the world hushed outside. He spoke of Mary Ellen then, fully of laughter and plans, of the day fire stole her from him. Sarah spoke of her husband, of quiet mornings and small kindnesses, of a life ended too soon. Tears came, not sharp but clean, grief shared instead of hidden. When Jed reached for her hand this time, she did not pull away. The touch was careful, reverent, like both of them understood what it meant. Nothing more happened that night, but something settled between them, solid and real. The ranch slept while two broken lives stood close enough to begin healing. Not because pain vanished, but because it no longer stood alone. Winter settled fully over the mountain ranch, snow pressing the world into stillness, nights long and quiet enough to make a person listen to their own thoughts whether they wanted to or not. Sarah learned the sound of the wind as it curled around the house, the way the stove breathed warmth into cold rooms, the rhythm of the men moving slower but steadier through their work. She belonged now, not because anyone said it outright, but because the ranch moved as if she had always been there. She cooked heavier meals, foods meant to carry strength through frozen mornings, and Jed made a habit of eating with the men more often. His presence grounding, familiar. The distance that once defined him softened into something solid and dependable. He trusted her judgment without question, consulted her on matters that reached beyond the kitchen, and when spring planning began, he asked her where she thought the ranch could grow stronger. Sarah answered carefully, knowing the weight of being heard, and Jed listened like her words mattered because they did. They did. The snow melted slow, revealing ground that had survived another hard season, and with it came new challenges. A sickness moved through neighboring ranches. Weak livestock, exhausted hands, fear carried on rumor. Jed acted quickly, limiting travel, increasing sanitation, taking precautions Sarah suggested without hesitation. The ranch was spared the worst of it, and the men noticed gratitude quiet but deep. One evening Buck said aloud what many had been thinking, that the ranch felt lucky now, like fortune had turned its face back toward them. Sarah smiled but said nothing. She had learned that luck was often just people choosing to care when it mattered most. As spring warmed the land, Jed and Sarah found themselves spending more time together without planning it. Walks along the fence line turned into conversations about the future, about what could be built instead of what had been lost. Jed spoke of expanding the gardens, of bringing families back to the ranch, of making it a place people wanted to stay instead of endure. Sarah spoke of teaching others to cook, of shared meals, of a table big enough for laughter again. Neither spoke of love outright. They did not need to. It lived in the spaces between words, in the way Jed waited for her pace without noticing, in the way Sarah kept his favorite mug warm by the stove. Trouble did not disappear. It never does, but when it came, it found a ranch no longer hollowed by grief. A late-season storm threatened the valley, flooding creeks and washing out trails, but the men attachment formed lines, sandbagged where needed, followed plans made long before panic could set in. Jed stood at the center of it, commanding without fear, eyes clear, present, and Sarah watched him with a quiet pride that surprised her. He was no longer the man frozen by flame. He was the man who had learned to step forward again. One night, after the waters receded and the danger passed, Jed found Sarah in the kitchen kneading dough, sleeves rolled, hair loose, face tired but peaceful. He leaned against the doorframe, watching her the way a person watches something precious they once thought lost. "You changed this place," he said. Sarah shook her head. "We did," she replied. He crossed the room then, slow, deliberate, and took her hands, flour dusting his fingers. "I don't want to pretend anymore," he said quietly. "I don't want to live like I'm waiting for something to break." Sarah searched his face, saw fear there still, but also courage. "Neither do I," she said, voice steady even as her heart raced. He kissed her then, gentle and unhurried, a promise rather than a claim. It felt like coming home to something new. They did not rush what followed. They spoke openly, set boundaries, honored the ghosts they both carried. Love grew not as a fire, but as a steady flame, reliable, warm, real. The ranch felt it too. Families returned, laughter returned. Children's voices echoed where silence once ruled. Sarah trained new cooks, taught them care mattered as much as skill. Jed built onto the main house. Not because it needed to be bigger, but because life had outgrown what it once was. When Jed asked Sarah to marry him, it was not grand. It was quiet, honest, asked over a shared meal as the sun set behind the mountains. She said yes with tears and a laugh because some things are too true for speeches. The wedding was small, held beneath open sky. The men and families of the ranch gathered close, food prepared with love and shared freely. Sarah stood strong and sure, not a woman saved, but a woman who had fought her way back to herself. Jed stood beside her not as a protector but as a partner. Together they built a life rooted in loss but grown in resilience. Proof that broken things can still hold beauty, that dignity can survive even the hardest roads. Years later, when travelers asked how the ranch came to thrive again, the men would say it started with a woman who cooked, beans in a dusty plaza and refused to believe she was worthless. And Sarah, stirring a pot by the window, would smile quietly knowing the truth. She had never been waiting to be rescued. She had been waiting for a place strong enough to meet her where she stood. If this story touched your heart, please like, subscribe, and share where you're watching from. And tell me in the comments what you would do if you were Sarah, because your words might help someone else who feels alone.